Officer Marcus Brennan had been with the Baton Rouge Police Department for 6 years when he walked into a situation that would destroy his career and cost the city $31.2 million. He was 29 years old, young enough to claim inexperience but old enough to understand consequences, but apparently convinced that his assessment of who belonged in emergency zones was infallible. One Saturday morning in a flooded residential neighborhood in North Baton Rouge, he received a call about a suspicious person photographing damaged properties in a restricted area. The suspicious person was Dr. Elaine Chambers, a 23-year FEMA veteran and regional director overseeing disaster response across 6 southeastern states, documenting flood damage in preparation for federal emergency declarations. What Brennan did next, dismissing her federal credentials as counterfeit, handcuffing her in knee-deep water in front of displaced residents, and transporting her to booking while emergency management officials frantically searched for their missing director, would become a textbook example of how racial profiling destroys lives, careers, and disaster response operations. The arrest delayed federal emergency declarations by 14 hours. That delay cost Louisiana an estimated $47 million in additional damage. And when the videos surfaced, Dr. Chambers being arrested while wearing a FEMA jacket with Regional Director printed across the back, the outrage wasn't just about one officer's bias. It was about a system that had allowed Marcus Brennan to accumulate 7 complaints about racial profiling in 6 years without meaningful consequences. A black woman in her early 50s, Dr. Elaine Chambers, stood in 8 inches of muddy water on Plank Road, photographing a collapsed drainage culvert at 9:17 a.m. Her FEMA credentials hung on a lanyard around her neck. Her phone was documenting infrastructure failure that would determine federal aid eligibility for 4,200 families. No crime, no interference, no obstruction, just a federal director doing her job. But Officer Brennan saw her through a lens so warped by assumptions that he couldn't process a black woman as legitimate federal authority. Before we get into what happened next, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these expose patterns that too many people want buried, and your support helps us bring accountability to light. North Baton Rouge's Garden District sits along Plank Road between Scotlandville and the Mississippi River. It's a historically black neighborhood of modest single-family homes, many built in the 1960s and 70s when Louisiana's oil economy was booming and black families could finally access homeownership in previously segregated areas. Small front yards, chain-link fences, carports, satellite dishes, working-class families, elderly residents on fixed incomes, young couples starting out. The kind of neighborhood where people know their neighbors, where church on Sunday matters, where floods have become a fact of life. It was 9:00 a.m. on a Saturday in late August. Hurricane Ida had passed through 36 hours earlier, dumping 14 inches of rain in 6 hours and overwhelming drainage systems that hadn't been upgraded since the 1980s. Water still covered the streets, brown and stagnant, pooling in yards and driveways. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of mud and sewage. Residents were outside assessing damage, pulling waterlogged furniture onto porches, checking on elderly neighbors, waiting for insurance adjusters who wouldn't arrive for days. FEMA's preliminary damage assessment teams had arrived at dawn. They moved systematically through affected neighborhoods, photographing infrastructure failures, documenting water levels, interviewing residents about damage extent. These assessments determined federal disaster declarations, which unlocked emergency funding, individual assistance programs, and infrastructure repair grants. Speed mattered. Every hour of delay meant more families stuck in damaged homes, more mold growth, more economic loss. Dr. Elaine Chambers had arrived at 8:30 a.m., leading the assessment herself. As regional director, she didn't have to be in the field, but Chambers believed in seeing damage firsthand. She'd learned that federal bureaucrats making decisions from offices hundreds of miles away often underestimated actual conditions. She wanted her teams to see what she saw, to understand the urgency. The morning was already heating up. Temperatures were climbing toward 92 degrees. Humidity made it feel like 105. Chambers wore khaki cargo pants, a FEMA-issued polo shirt, and a bright yellow FEMA jacket with Regional Director stenciled across the back in 3-inch letters. Her federal credentials were visible on a lanyard. Her government-issued phone was documenting everything. She looked exactly like what she was, a federal official conducting disaster assessment. The kind of Saturday morning where help was supposed to arrive, not handcuffs. Dr. Elaine Chambers had been with FEMA for 23 years responding to hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, and wildfires across America. She'd started as a disaster assistance specialist in Atlanta, processing individual assistance applications and learning federal emergency management from the ground up. She'd been promoted to Recovery Division Chief after Hurricane Katrina, coordinating $4.7 billion in rebuilding grants. She'd served as Deputy Regional Director during Superstorm Sandy, managing simultaneous responses across 7 states. In 2019, she was appointed Regional Director for FEMA Region 4, overseeing emergency operations across 8 southeastern states. Her responsibilities: 63 million people, 487 counties, 8 state agencies, coordination with federal departments. When disasters struck, she deployed teams, authorized spending, briefed governors, coordinated with the White House. Her supervisors called her decisive. Her staff called her the director who understood what families needed. Chambers graduated from Spelman College with a political science degree, then earned her master's in public administration from UNC Chapel Hill, focusing on emergency management policy. She'd completed advanced FEMA training at the Emergency Management Institute, Incident Command System, National Incident Management System, Leadership and Influence. She'd served on the National Advisory Council reviewing FEMA policies. She'd testified before Congress 4 times about disaster preparedness. She'd published research on equitable disaster recovery. She'd received the Administrator's Award for Excellence twice, FEMA's highest internal honor. Her credentials proved someone who'd dedicated her life to helping communities recover from catastrophe. At 52, Elaine Chambers was exactly where she'd worked to be, trusted with enormous responsibility, respected across the emergency management community. She was divorced, her marriage ending under the strain of constant deployments and 80-hour disaster weeks. 2 adult children in graduate school, both proud despite childhoods watching her leave for hurricanes. She lived in suburban Atlanta. She ran marathons. She collected vintage jazz records. She attended a small AME church where she sang in the choir when schedules allowed. Serious about work but warm with teams, demanding but fair. That Saturday, Chambers had been in Louisiana since Thursday night, arriving hours after Hurricane Ida's landfall to establish FEMA's forward command in Baton Rouge. She'd spent Friday coordinating with state officials, briefing the governor, planning damage assessments across 14 parishes. She'd worked until 11 o'clock p.m., slept 4 hours, and been back in the field by 7:30 a.m. She'd arrived in North Baton Rouge at 8:30 a.m., part of a 3-vehicle convoy including 2 assessment specialists and a state liaison. They split up to cover more ground, reconvening at 11 a.m. Chambers had been documenting systematically, photographing flooded streets, measuring water depth, noting infrastructure damage, interviewing residents. At 9:15 a.m., she stood in Plank Road near Mohican Street, photographing a collapsed drainage culvert that had contributed to catastrophic flooding in 4 blocks. The culvert failure justified federal emergency declarations and unlocked Army Corps funding. She wore her credentials visibly. Her jacket identified her role in letters large enough to read from 20 feet away. Her government vehicle was parked 30 yards away, FEMA logos on both doors. She'd spoken with a dozen residents who recognized her as federal help arriving. She looked like what she was, a federal disaster official documenting damage to secure emergency funding. But to Officer Marcus Brennan, responding to a call about suspicious activity in a restricted zone, Elaine Chambers' presence didn't compute. A black woman in floodwater with a phone, photographing damaged property, wearing what looked like official gear? In his mind, that couldn't be legitimate federal authority. That had to be looting reconnaissance, insurance fraud documentation, or media exploitation of disaster victims. And he decided to do something about it. Marcus Brennan was 29 years old. He'd been a patrol officer with the Baton Rouge Police Department for 6 years, assigned to the North Precinct covering predominantly black neighborhoods. He was enthusiastic about what he called proactive policing, stopping suspicious activity before it escalated. His supervisors described him as results-oriented but overzealous in interpreting suspicious behavior. His arrest numbers were high, which the department praised. His complaint numbers were also high, which the department addressed with training that Brennan attended but never internalized. He was convinced his instincts about criminal activity were reliable, that his assessments of who belonged where were accurate, and that questioning his authority meant probable guilt. In 6 years, Brennan had compiled 7 complaints. 7. All involving racial profiling of black residents in situations where he assumed they didn't belong. A black homeowner repairing his fence in Spanish Town was detained 30 minutes while Brennan verified he actually lived there, despite the man producing mail and utility bills. A black woman jogging through LSU's campus was stopped and questioned about whether she had permission to be there, despite campus being public. A black contractor working on a home renovation was detained and searched after Brennan assumed burglary, even though the contractor had tools, a work truck with his company name, and the homeowner's phone number. A black teenager photographing architecture for a school project was questioned about gang affiliation because Brennan assumed he was documenting burglary targets. 2 complaints had been sustained, resulting in written reprimands and mandatory training. 5 were closed as not sustained, despite witness statements and body camera footage showing Brennan's pattern. The pattern was unmistakable. 7 complaints in 6 years, all involving the same demographic, all involving Brennan's inability to imagine black people as legitimate residents, students, contractors, or professionals. But the department treated each complaint in isolation, never connecting them, never acknowledging the pattern. That Saturday at 9:12 a.m., Brennan received dispatch, suspicious person in the restricted flood zone near Plank Road and Mohican, possibly photographing properties for looting. The caller, a white resident monitoring his property via security camera, had seen someone with a phone documenting houses. Brennan responded immediately. Floodwaters created looting opportunities. People photographed vulnerable properties. The person wearing official-looking gear reinforced his suspicion. Criminals often posed as utility workers to access damaged properties. He didn't consider legitimate FEMA operations. He assumed criminal activity. The arrival approach, 67 words. Brennan arrived at 9:16 a.m., wading toward a figure 40 yards away, photographing in deeper water. As he got closer, his assumptions confirmed. Black woman, expensive phone, photographing damage, official-looking jacket. That combination screamed fraud. Real FEMA officials didn't work alone in floodwater. His eyes locked on Dr. Chambers, back to him, photographing the collapsed culvert. He approached directly, hand on his radio. Do you think officers with multiple sustained complaints for racial profiling should be automatically removed from patrol assignments? Drop your answer below. Dr. Chambers was photographing the drainage culvert from multiple angles, documenting how the concrete structure had collapsed under water pressure, creating a debris dam that had worsened flooding throughout the neighborhood. She was focused, methodical, occasionally narrating into her phone's voice recorder. Culvert failure, approximately 8 feet in diameter, complete structural collapse, debris accumulation backing up drainage flow estimated at 400 gallons per minute. She became aware of someone approaching, heavy footsteps splashing through water. She turned and saw a Baton Rouge police officer wading toward her, expression set, hand near his radio. Ma'am, step away from that area. Chambers looked around, confused. The area was a public street. There were no barriers, no caution tape, nothing indicating restriction. I'm documenting flood damage for federal assessment. I have authorization. Brennan's tone sharpened. This is a restricted emergency zone. You need to leave now. Restricted? Officer, I'm authorized to be here. I work in disaster response. This is my job. Brennan stopped 3 feet away, water up to his shins. His eyes scanned her, yellow FEMA jacket, credentials on lanyard, government phone, professional posture. But his mind had already decided what he was seeing. You're interfering with emergency operations. I'm going to need to see some ID. Chambers felt the first spike of recognition. She'd heard these exact words in dozens of implicit bias trainings. This wasn't about emergency operations. This was about assumptions. Evidence presentation, 298 words. She reached for the laminated credential hanging around her neck and held it up at eye level. The federal seal was clearly visible. Her photo, her name, her title, Regional Director, FEMA Region 4. This is my identification. Dr. Elaine Chambers, FEMA Regional Director, Southeast Division. I'm conducting damage assessment for federal emergency declaration purposes. Brennan glanced at the credential. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. Anyone can print a badge. Put your phone down and step back from the property. Chambers felt disbelief rising. This credential wasn't printed. It was issued by the Department of Homeland Security with embedded security features, holographic seals, and magnetic strip encoding. It was impossible to fake convincingly. Officer, this is legitimate federal identification. You can verify with one call to FEMA Region 4 headquarters in Atlanta. The number is on the credential. She pointed to the contact information printed clearly below her photo. I don't have time for verification games. I'm ordering you to leave this area. Dr. Chambers' professional composure was being tested. She'd dealt with difficult local officials before, with bureaucrats who resented federal authority, with politicians who wanted credit for disaster response. But she'd never been ordered to leave a disaster site by local law enforcement. I'm not leaving. I'm authorized by federal emergency management law to access disaster zones for assessment purposes. That authority supersedes local restrictions. Brennan's hand moved to his handcuffs. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Chambers stared at him. You're making a serious mistake, officer. You're under arrest for obstruction of emergency operations. This is where assumptions become accusations, where bias becomes impenetrable. Officer Brennan had responded to a call about a suspicious person photographing flood damage. When he arrived, he saw a black woman photographing flood damage. In his mind, that confirmed the suspicion. Every piece of evidence that followed, the federal credential, the professional demeanor, the FEMA jacket with Regional Director printed across the back, was filtered through his initial assumption. He wasn't looking at a federal disaster official. He was looking at someone sophisticated enough to create convincing fake identification. The evidence couldn't penetrate the bias. The neighborhood had gone silent. Residents who'd been salvaging belongings from flooded homes had stopped to watch. An elderly man on his porch called out, "That's FEMA. She's been helping people all morning." Brennan ignored him. "Ma'am, hands behind your back. Now." Chambers calculated her options. She could refuse and risk being physically forced into handcuffs. She could continue arguing and escalate the confrontation. Or she could comply, let this catastrophic mistake play out, and document everything for the federal civil rights lawsuit she was already mentally drafting. "I'm complying under protest. I am Dr. Elaine Chambers, Regional Director of FEMA. This officer is arresting a federal official conducting lawful emergency assessment operations. Everyone witnessing this, please document it." Phones came out immediately. A woman near the corner started recording. A teenager on a bicycle pulled out his phone. An older man filming from his porch called out again. "This is wrong. She's been checking damage for federal aid." Brennan ignored them all. He grabbed Dr. Chambers' arm, rougher than necessary, and pulled her hands behind her back. The handcuffs clicked tight, deliberately tight. "Those are too tight. Officer, I'm not resisting. There's no need for—" Brennan yanked the cuffs tighter. "You're under arrest for obstruction. You have the right to remain silent. I know my rights. I'm a federal law enforcement trained official. I'm also documenting that you refused to verify credentials, used unnecessary force, and are arresting me without probable cause." The crowd was growing, more residents emerging from homes drawn by the commotion, more phones recording. A woman shouted from across the street, "Why are you arresting her? She's helping us. Step back. This is police business." Brennan marched Dr. Chambers through knee-deep water toward his patrol car, still handcuffed, her credentials still hanging around her neck, swaying with each step. She focused on staying upright, on not giving him any excuse to claim resistance. "I want your name and badge number. I want your supervisor's contact information, and I want to know who made the call that brought you here. You'll get everything you need at the station." They reached his patrol car. Brennan opened the back door. "Watch your head." He guided her into the back seat, not gently, but not violently enough to constitute obvious excessive force, just rough enough to assert dominance. Before he closed the door, Chambers spoke clearly, her voice carrying to the crowd of residents now gathered 20 feet away. "This arrest will delay federal emergency declarations for this parish. Every hour I spend in booking is an hour families wait for assistance. This officer is interfering with federal disaster response operations, and that's a federal crime." Brennan slammed the door. He got behind the wheel and pulled away, splashing through standing water, leaving behind a neighborhood full of witnesses with phones full of video. Dr. Chambers looked out the window at the receding crowd. The story was already spreading, and somewhere in Atlanta her staff was about to panic when she missed her 10 o'clock a.m. check-in call. Should officers be required to verify federal credentials with dispatch before making arrests in nonviolent situations? Let me know what you think. The Baton Rouge Police Department's North Precinct received an emergency call at 9:51 a.m., 37 minutes after Brennan's arrest. The caller was Michael Torres, Deputy Director of Louisiana's Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, and he was beyond furious. One of your officers just arrested FEMA's Regional Director. Dr. Elaine Chambers is in custody right now, and we need her released immediately. Federal disaster response is being delayed because your officer couldn't verify a federal credential. Captain Raymond Dutton, a 19-year veteran who'd coordinated with FEMA during Katrina, Rita, Gustav, and Isaac, felt his stomach drop. Say that again. Torres repeated it, his voice tight with controlled anger. Your officer arrested FEMA's Regional Director for photographing flood damage, the director who controls whether Louisiana gets federal emergency declarations. She's in your booking facility right now. Dutton was already moving, grabbing his radio. Dutton reached the booking desk at 10:03 a.m. Dr. Chambers was still in handcuffs, seated on a bench, surrounded by paperwork. Brennan was completing arrest documentation. What are the charges? Brennan looked up. Obstruction of emergency operations. Suspect was photographing damaged properties in a restricted flood zone, refused to leave when ordered, presented fake federal credentials. Dutton walked directly to Dr. Chambers. Ma'am, I'm Captain Dutton. May I see your credentials? Chambers nodded toward the lanyard still around her neck. Dutton lifted it, examined it closely. He'd seen enough federal credentials during disaster responses to recognize authenticity. The holographic seal shifted correctly under different light angles. The magnetic strip showed proper encoding ridges. The paper stock had the correct weight and texture. He pulled out his phone and called the number printed on the credential. FEMA Region 4 headquarters answered on the second ring. Dutton asked for identity verification. They confirmed Dr. Elaine Chambers' position, credentials, and current deployment to Louisiana within 90 seconds. Dutton hung up and turned to Brennan, his expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. These credentials are legitimate. You arrested FEMA's Regional Director. Brennan's face went pale. She said, I thought anyone can fake a Officer Brennan. Badge, radio, and weapon. Administrative duty assignment effective immediately. Captain, I was responding to a call. You arrested a federal official conducting lawful emergency operations after she showed you DHS-issued credentials and offered to let you verify them. Give me your badge. Brennan's hands shook as he unclipped his badge and handed it over, followed by his radio and service weapon. For the first time, he seemed to understand the magnitude of what he'd done, but the call was from a panicked homeowner who didn't know what FEMA looks like. You should have verified. That's basic procedure. Get out of my sight. Dutton turned to Dr. Chambers, who was finally being uncuffed by a sergeant who looked mortified. Dr. Chambers, on behalf of the Baton Rouge Police Department, I sincerely apologize. This is inexcusable and unacceptable. Chambers rubbed her wrists. Deep red marks were visible where the handcuffs had dug into her skin. Captain Dutton, I appreciate the apology, but I need you to understand something. This arrest delayed federal response operations. Families are waiting for help. Infrastructure assessments are incomplete. And I was pulled away from my job because one of your officers couldn't imagine a black woman as legitimate federal authority. Dutton had no response. There was nothing he could say. Should officers face automatic suspension after wrongful arrests of federal officials conducting emergency operations? Drop your answer. Within 3 hours, the videos had exploded across every social media platform. Multiple angles from different residents showed the entire encounter. Dr. Chambers identifying herself, showing her credentials, being handcuffed anyway, being marched through floodwater while wearing a jacket that clearly said FEMA Regional Director across the back. Black FEMA Director arrested while documenting Louisiana flood damage. Police officer arrests federal disaster official, delays emergency aid to hurricane victims. Wearing FEMA jacket wasn't enough. Regional Director handcuffed for doing her job while black. The outrage was immediate and explosive. The Department of Homeland Security issued a statement condemning the arrest and demanding accountability. The National Emergency Management Association called for federal investigation. Civil rights organizations demanded prosecution. Louisiana's governor called Baton Rouge's mayor personally, furious that local police had interfered with federal disaster response. FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell released a statement. Dr. Chambers is one of the most dedicated and capable disaster response professionals in America. She was doing her job, helping families affected by Hurricane Ida. That she was arrested while wearing clearly marked federal credentials is beyond unacceptable. Immediate consequences for antagonist, 143 words. Officer Marcus Brennan's life imploded within 48 hours. The Baton Rouge Police Department placed him on unpaid administrative leave pending investigation. The Louisiana State Police opened a civil rights investigation. The FBI's Civil Rights Division launched a federal inquiry into whether Brennan had violated Dr. Chambers' constitutional rights. The videos showed everything: a black woman in a FEMA jacket, federal credentials visible, being arrested despite identifying herself clearly and offering verification procedures. There was no ambiguity, no gray area, no reasonable interpretation where Brennan's actions were justified. Brennan released a statement through his attorney. "I responded to a dispatch call about suspicious activity. I made a judgment error. I apologize to Dr. Chambers and to the families whose disaster assistance was delayed." The statement satisfied no one. The damage was done. Dr. Elaine Chambers filed a federal civil rights lawsuit 29 days after the incident. The lawsuit named Officer Marcus Brennan, Captain Raymond Dutton for supervisory failure, the Baton Rouge Police Department, and the city of Baton Rouge. The claims were comprehensive and devastating: unlawful arrest without probable cause, false imprisonment, violation of federal civil rights under 42 U.S.C. FAR 1983, racial profiling and discrimination, interference with federal emergency management operations under the Stafford Act, excessive use of force, unnecessarily tight handcuffs, intentional infliction of emotional distress, failure to train and supervise officers with documented patterns of discriminatory policing. The complaint included Brennan's complete complaint history: 7 complaints over 6 years, all involving racial profiling of black residents, 2 sustained with minimal consequences, 5 dismissed despite corroborating evidence. The pattern was undeniable. The complaint also detailed the consequences of Brennan's arrest: federal emergency declarations delayed by 14 hours, damage assessments incomplete, coordination with state officials disrupted, FEMA personnel diverted from disaster response to locate their missing director. The ripple effects had cost Louisiana an estimated $47 million in additional storm damage and delayed assistance to 4,200 families. The city of Baton Rouge's attorneys reviewed the evidence and reached an inevitable conclusion: completely indefensible. The videos were everywhere. The witnesses were credible. The federal credentials were authentic. The FEMA jacket said Regional Director in letters visible from 30 feet away. Dr. Chambers had identified herself clearly, offered verification procedures, and complied with arrest. Brennan had 7 prior complaints showing the same pattern. The city had failed to address those complaints meaningfully. The city settled 11 months after the incident, paying $31.2 million to Dr. Elaine Chambers. The settlement was the largest civil rights payout in Louisiana history. It included terms requiring the Baton Rouge Police Department to implement comprehensive reforms: federal credential recognition training, automatic verification procedures before arrests of anyone claiming federal authority, and immediate removal from patrol after 3 sustained discrimination complaints. Marcus Brennan was terminated 11 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was final and unambiguous. Officer Brennan arrested a federal official conducting lawful emergency operations, refused to verify legitimate Department of Homeland Security credentials despite being offered clear verification procedures, and interfered with federal disaster response during a declared emergency. His actions delayed federal assistance to thousands of Louisiana families affected by Hurricane Ida. Despite 7 prior complaints involving racial profiling and 2 sustained findings requiring remedial training, Officer Brennan continued to demonstrate discriminatory policing practices. His employment is terminated immediately with no appeal rights. Brennan's name was entered into the National Decertification Index. His law enforcement career ended at 29 years old. He would never work in policing again. His attorney released a brief statement. Mr. Brennan accepts responsibility for his errors in judgment and wishes to apologize to all those affected. No one was listening. Dr. Elaine Chambers testified before the Louisiana House Committee on Civil Law and Procedure during hearings on police accountability legislation. Her testimony was powerful, measured, and devastating. I'm a federal disaster response professional with 23 years of experience. I hold a doctorate in public administration. I've responded to dozens of hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, and earthquakes. I've coordinated disaster recovery operations involving billions of dollars in federal aid. I've briefed presidents, governors, senators, and congressional committees. I've testified before Congress about emergency management policy. I've received the highest honors my agency can bestow. She paused, letting the credentials sink in. On August 30th, I was standing in floodwater in North Baton Rouge, documenting infrastructure damage that would determine federal aid eligibility for over 4,000 families. I wore a FEMA jacket with my title printed across the back. My federal credentials were visible on a lanyard around my neck. I identified myself clearly to Officer Brennan. I showed him my credentials. I offered him verification procedures, a single phone call to confirm my identity and authority, and I was arrested anyway. Another pause. Officer Brennan had 7 complaints in 6 years. 7. Every single one involved allegations that he'd racially profiled black residents, assuming we didn't belong in certain neighborhoods, certain businesses, certain professional roles. 2 complaints were sustained. He received reprimands and training, but nothing changed, because the system treated each complaint in isolation, never acknowledging the pattern, never removing him from situations where his bias endangered public safety. Her voice strengthened. The city paid me $31.2 million. That's accountability on paper. That's recognition that what happened was wrong. But money doesn't undo being handcuffed in front of disaster victims I was trying to help. Money doesn't restore the 14 hours of disaster response operations that were delayed because I was in a booking facility instead of coordinating federal aid. Money doesn't erase the message that was sent to every black professional in Louisiana. Your credentials don't matter. Your authority doesn't matter. Your expertise doesn't matter if someone sees your skin color first. She looked directly at the committee members. I'm FEMA's Regional Director. I control emergency funding for 8 states. I have federal law enforcement training. I work directly with governors and senators. I brief the White House during major disasters. And none of that was enough to prevent Officer Brennan from deciding I didn't belong in a disaster zone. The room was absolutely silent. So I want you to think about something. If this can happen to me, with all my credentials, all my authority, all my institutional backing, what happens to the black contractor working on a renovation, the black college student photographing architecture, the black homeowner checking flood damage at his own house? What happens to people who don't have federal agencies defending them, attorneys on speed dial, or settlements to make headlines? They get arrested, they get records, they get trauma, and nothing changes. Should states require automatic federal investigation after law enforcement arrests of federal officials during emergency operations? Drop your answer. This wasn't just about one arrest on one Saturday morning in one flooded neighborhood. This was about a police department that allowed Marcus Brennan to accumulate 7 complaints involving racial profiling without removing him from patrol. This was about a system that treated each discriminatory incident as an isolated mistake rather than recognizing an obvious documented pattern. This was about bias so deeply embedded that even a FEMA jacket couldn't penetrate it. Marcus Brennan's complaint history told a story his supervisors chose to ignore. 7 complaints in 6 years. All 7 involving assumptions that black people didn't belong, in affluent neighborhoods, on college campuses, in parks, at professional work sites, in emergency zones. The pattern was unmistakable. Brennan saw black people in spaces his biased mind coded as white or professional, and he assumed criminality. Each complaint was addressed individually. Verbal counseling, written reprimand, implicit bias training, conflict resolution workshops. But the department never connected them, never acknowledged that 7 complaints in 6 years wasn't bad luck or misunderstanding. It was a pattern of discriminatory policing. And because they failed to connect those dots, Brennan remained on patrol. And when he responded to a call about suspicious activity in a disaster zone, he brought that same bias with him. He saw a black woman photographing flood damage, and even when she wore a federal jacket and showed federal credentials, he couldn't see a legitimate official. He could only see someone who didn't belong. Marcus Brennan's career is over. That's justice. The city of Baton Rouge paid $31.2 million. That's accountability. The police department was forced to implement federal credential verification training and complaint tracking systems. That's consequence. But terminations and settlements don't undo the trauma of being arrested for doing your job. They don't restore the dignity of being handcuffed in front of people you're trying to help. They don't erase the 14 hours of delayed disaster response that cost Louisiana families tens of millions in additional damage. They don't change the message that was sent. Your credentials mean nothing if your skin color triggers someone's bias. The real question, 138 words. The real question is, what changes now? Do police departments finally remove officers after 3 sustained discrimination complaints instead of 7? Do supervisors finally recognize patterns instead of treating each complaint as an isolated incident? Do we finally train officers that federal credentials deserve verification, not dismissal? Do we finally acknowledge that racial bias isn't just about individual prejudice? It's about systems that protect officers who demonstrate patterns of discrimination? Because if we don't fix the complaint review systems that kept Brennan on patrol for 6 years despite 7 documented incidents, if we don't address the culture that taught him a black woman couldn't be a federal director, then we're just waiting for the next Marcus Brennan, the next Dr. Elaine Chambers, the next disaster zone where bias interferes with emergency response. Comment if you believe this should be federal law. Law enforcement officers who arrest federal officials conducting lawful operations face automatic federal investigation, mandatory decertification proceedings, and departments lose federal funding until accountability reforms are implemented. And if you think these stories matter, if you believe accountability starts with exposing patterns, if you think disaster victims deserve federal officials who can work without being arrested for their skin color, then hit that subscribe button. We're not stopping. We're going to keep documenting these patterns. We're going to keep demanding that 7 complaints mean something. We're going to keep fighting for every professional whose credentials aren't enough to overcome bias. This isn't just about one officer or one federal director. It's about all of us and the world we choose to accept. The world where FEMA jackets aren't enough, where credentials don't matter, where bias arrests people while floods destroy homes. That's the world we're changing.